When I was old enough to stay home alone, but still young enough to feel a mix of excitement and unease about it, I lived in a small court in a lower-end, middle-class neighborhood. It wasn't a flashy or bustling place, but it had its charm. A quiet, developing town still waiting for the inevitable boom of city growth. Back then, the streets were peaceful, almost eerily so, and kids spent their days playing outside without a care in the world. From the moment the sun rose until the night crept in, we played tag, rode our bikes, and let the hours slip away without a thought of danger. To paint a clearer picture, the court I lived in was a simple U-shape with 8 houses neatly arranged along its curve. There was only one way in or out, which made it feel like a world of its own, separated from the busier streets beyond. My friend Allie lived right across from me, just a few houses away from the entrance of the court, and my house mirrored hers on the opposite side. Both of our homes sat near the exit, 3 houses down from the street that connected us to the rest of the town. But even calling it a street feels generous. It was more of a quiet road that hardly anyone ever used. This dead-end quality was both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, we had the freedom to play on the street for hours without worrying about traffic. On the other, the isolation meant that anyone who did come by stood out. The truth was, unless someone had business in our little court, visiting a neighbor or making a delivery, they had no reason to be there. The other homes in the area were more conveniently accessed from the main roads. Our court was a detour, a place you'd only go if you had a specific purpose. That's what made it feel safe, but also on that one particular night, deeply unsettling. One important detail to mention is that Allie's parents weren't the friendliest people. They didn't like having visitors at their house and made it clear they didn't want kids hanging around their yard. Because of that, Allie and I always hung out at my house or played on the court itself. It was just the way things were, and we didn't think much of it at the time. It was Halloween night. The fun and excitement of the evening had died down hours ago, and the streets were now completely silent. The last few trick-or-treaters had long since gone home to sort through their candy hauls, and the glow of porch lights was beginning to fade as people settled in for the night. My family had left earlier to go trick-or-treating in one of the wealthy neighborhoods. They were on a mission to snag the coveted king-sized candy bars, and afterward, they planned to hang out at a friend's house. I knew they might not be home until late, or possibly not at all. I didn't want to spend the evening tagging along with my younger siblings and their friends, so I asked my mom if I could stay home alone and hang out with Allie instead. She agreed, but made me promise to go inside and lock the doors as soon as we were done. I assured her I would, not thinking much of it at the time. By the time Allie and I started winding down for the night, it was close to 10 or 11 p.m. We were sitting on the curb in front of my house, talking quietly and enjoying the stillness of the night. Allie was waiting for her parents to call her in, and I was just glad for the company. At that age, we were in that awkward pre-teen stage, too old to go trick-or-treating ourselves, but too young to do much else. Sitting on the curb and talking about random things felt like the perfect way to end the night. That's when we saw him. A man appeared at the far end of the court, walking along the street just beyond the entrance. He moved slowly, his head turning as if he were looking for something or someone. When he noticed us sitting there, he paused for a moment, his eyes lingering on us before he continued walking. It wasn't a big deal at first, just a passing stranger, but something about him felt off. He didn't look familiar, and in our small town that was unusual. Everyone knew everyone, or at least recognized a face, but this man was a stranger. He was white, of average build, with a noticeable beer belly. Even in the dim light of the street lamps, I could make out his tan jacket, dark blue jeans, and heavy-looking work boots. He didn't fit in, and his presence felt strange. Allie noticed it too. "Do you know him?" she asked, her voice low. I shook my head. "No, never seen him before." We tried to brush it off and went back to talking, but Allie kept glancing toward the entrance of the court. Something about the man had unsettled her. A few minutes later, she nudged me. "He's back." I looked up to see the man walking past the entrance of the court again, this time moving in the opposite direction. He didn't look at us this time, but the fact that he was back at all made my stomach twist. Then he passed by a third time, and a fourth. By the fifth time, we were both on edge. "That guy keeps coming back," Allie said, frowning. I turned my back to the entrance, trying to focus on our conversation and ignore the growing unease. But Allie's voice stopped me cold. "He's just standing there." I whipped around to look, And sure enough, the man was now standing under the streetlight at the entrance of the court. He wasn't moving, just standing there with his hands shoved into his jacket pockets, staring directly at us. His posture was casual, like he was trying not to seem threatening, but the way he stared made my skin crawl. "I'm creeped out. Let's go inside," Allie whispered. We stood up, trying to act like we weren't bothered, and I walked her across the street to her house. I always made sure my friends got home safely. It was just who I was. After seeing her safely to her door, I quickly crossed back to my own house, eager to get inside and lock the door behind me. But when I grabbed the doorknob, it didn't move. The door was locked. My heart sank. My family never locked the door unless we were all inside for the night, and I didn't have a key. It hit me then that I was completely locked out, and with no cell phone to call for help, I was stuck. Trying to stay calm, I decided to check the back door. Surely, the sliding glass door in the backyard would be unlocked. As I started down the path toward the side gate, I stopped dead in my tracks. The man was back. He stood at the court's entrance again, but this time, he was smiling. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of grin that made my stomach churn. His eyes lit up when he saw me, and he raised a hand in a casual wave before taking a step toward me. His movements were slow and deliberate, and his gaze never left mine. Without thinking, I bolted back across the street to Allie's house, my heart pounding in my chest. I banged on her door, pressing the doorbell over and over until she opened it, her face filled with confusion. "What's wrong?" she asked. "I'm locked out, and he's coming," I cried. Allie hesitated, glancing over her shoulder. I have to ask my mom," she stammered, then shut the door, leaving me alone on the porch. I turned back toward the street, my whole body trembling. The man was no longer walking. He was running now, moving diagonally across the street toward me. My mind raced, and just when I thought it was too late, the door flung open, and Allie yanked me inside. She slammed the door shut and locked it, and we both ran to the window, peeking out through the curtains. The man was standing right where I had been moments before. His chest heaved as he glared at the house, his face twisted with rage. He stayed there for what felt like forever before shoving his hands back into his pockets and walking away into the night. Allie's mom called the police. I stayed at their house until my parents got home, and Allie's dad walked me back to my house. It turned out my younger brother had locked the door before leaving because he was scared of bad guys. After that night, my parents didn't leave me home alone again until we moved to a new town years later. I never found out what that man wanted, whether it was a kidnapping or something worse, but to this day, I can't shake the unease I feel around strangers who smile too much. This memory is one of the earliest and most vivid ones I have from my childhood. I was only about 6 years old when it happened, just after my family had moved into a new house. It was a typical suburban neighborhood, and everything felt fresh and exciting. My sister and I had always been huge fans of Christmas, decorating the tree, the lights, the presents, and of course, the idea of Santa Claus. But this year, something would happen that would forever change the way I looked at Christmas. It was Christmas Eve, and I couldn't sleep. The anticipation of the holiday had my mind racing. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, the excitement keeping me wide awake. I wasn't scared, just buzzing with excitement. I'd tried to fall asleep a few times, but failed miserably. Eventually, I grabbed the remote to my old box TV and started playing one of my favorite games, Star Wars on the PS1. I'd play until I was too tired to keep my eyes open. That was my routine every year. This night, though, was different. I remember playing for hours, getting lost in the game. After a while, I needed to use the bathroom. I turned down the volume on the TV so I wouldn't wake anyone, and I crept out of my room. I didn't want my mom to hear me sneaking around. She'd be mad if she knew I was up this late on Christmas Eve. I tiptoed across the hallway to the stairs, careful not to make a sound. The house was quiet and everything felt peaceful. As I reached the top of the stairs, I had to pass by the bathroom, but before I could open the door, I heard something. A soft rustling sound coming from downstairs. At first, I thought it was just the wind or something, but then it came again louder this time. The rustling sound was coming from the living room. My heart skipped a beat. Could it be Santa Claus? I froze for a moment, then slowly crept to the top of the stairs. I tried to keep my footsteps light, but the wooden floor creaked beneath me. I didn't care. I was determined to see what was going on. As I carefully made my way down the stairs, the sound grew louder and more distinct. It was the sound of rustling tree branches, like someone was moving around behind the Christmas tree. I reached the bottom of the stairs and cautiously peeked around the corner of the living room wall. What I saw was not what I expected. There, standing in the dark living room, was a man. He was crouched down behind the tree, holding a flashlight that illuminated the area around him. I could only see his legs at first, but I could tell he was wearing dark clothes. There was a large black bag lying on the floor next to him. My breath caught in my throat. I could barely believe my eyes. This wasn't Santa. It wasn't even someone I recognized. I stood frozen, unable to move, my mind racing with confusion and fear. The man suddenly stood up, looking directly at me. His face was cold and stern, and I couldn't make out much detail except for his piercing eyes. He looked like he hadn't expected anyone to be there, and for a moment I thought maybe I'd imagined it all. But then he did something that chilled me to the bone. He put his finger to his lips, making the universal shh motion. He whispered, "Yes, I'm Santa." I felt a surge of panic. I was old enough to know that wasn't Santa. It didn't make sense. Santa wasn't supposed to be a stranger in my house in the middle of the night. And this man, he was too unfamiliar, too wrong. The bag he had wasn't filled with presents for me. It was filled with the gifts he'd already stolen from under the tree. I screamed louder than I ever had before. My voice echoed through the empty house. I wasn't thinking clearly. All I knew was that there was a stranger in my house, and I needed to get my parents. I screamed and screamed, hoping someone would hear me. The man reacted in a panic. He glanced between me, the bag of gifts, and the front door. His eyes darted around the room as if he were deciding whether to run or stay. I remember him grabbing the black bag and quickly heading for the door. My legs were frozen, my heart racing, but I didn't stop screaming. I heard the man fumbling with the door, and then it opened. He bolted outside, disappearing into the night. Within seconds, my parents came rushing down the stairs. I remember my dad in his slippers, looking frantic. I could barely catch my breath, but I kept repeating what had happened. "There's a man in the house. He was behind the tree." I pointed to the bag lying on the floor in the living room, the one that was supposed to be filled with Christmas presents. My mom was already on the phone with the police, and my dad rushed outside to look around. I didn't understand everything that was happening, but I could tell it was serious. The bag of gifts was full of things we hadn't even opened yet. Half of the ornaments from our tree were gone, some of the most sentimental ones. Those ornaments had been passed down through the generations in my family, and now they were stolen. My dad went outside in his slippers, not caring about the cold, and started searching the yard. I heard him yelling, looking for any sign of the man. He was furious. He kept saying he would have done anything to catch him. My mom tried to calm him down, but I could tell she was just as scared as I was. The police arrived a little while later. They took statements from my parents and examined the back door. It had been forced open with a crowbar. The wood was chipped and the lock was broken. The officers said it looked like the man had been planning this for a while. It wasn't long before we found out that another house, just a few blocks away, had been hit by the same person. The break-in was reported on the local news the next day. It was clear that this man had been going around, stealing presents and decorations from families. He had targeted us, and we had just happened to catch him. As a 6-year-old, I didn't understand everything at the time, but I'll never forget that feeling of fear and confusion. The terror of seeing a stranger in my home, in the place where I felt safest. That Christmas Eve is a memory that stuck with me through the years. And to this day, I can't shake the image of that man standing behind our Christmas tree, trying to steal away the holiday spirit. Winter was in full swing when my friend Sam and I decided to book a cabin for the weekend. The idea of relaxing in the snowy wilderness, sipping coffee, and watching the snowfall sounded perfect. We found a beautiful cabin online, nestled deep in the woods, and Sam shared the pin location with me. The photos were breathtaking, a wooden haven surrounded by a pristine white blanket of snow. Excited, we packed our bags and prepared for the 4-hour drive from our house to the cabin. The journey was magical. Snow-covered trees lined the roads, their branches glistening under the moonlight. The silence of the winter night was occasionally broken by the crunching sound of snow under our car tires. It was almost midnight when we arrived at the cabin. The place looked even better in person. The warm glow from the cabin windows reflecting off the surrounding snow created a postcard-perfect scene. We unloaded our luggage and stepped inside. The interior was cozy, with a fireplace crackling softly in the corner. Sam quickly prepared coffee while I admired the view outside. Snowflakes fell gently, illuminated by the porch light. The tranquility of the place made us forget the stresses of our everyday lives. After coffee, we chatted for a while before deciding to call it a night. I was drifting off to sleep when a piercing scream jolted me awake. At first, I thought I had imagined it, but a few minutes later, the scream came again. It was unmistakably a woman's voice, filled with terror. My heart raced as I sat up and listened. Sam too was awake now, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, trying to process what I had just heard. Grabbing a flashlight, I stepped out into the cold night. The air was eerily still, and the only sound was the crunch of snow beneath my boots. A few feet away, I noticed another cabin, its windows dimly lit as if by candlelight. The screams seemed to be coming from that direction. As I approached, the sound of a woman crying reached my ears. My stomach turned, but I forced myself to move closer. Peering through the window, I saw two men inside. One of them was holding a knife, and his face was partially covered by a hood. The other man was standing over a terrified woman who was tied to a chair, tears streaming down her face. Suddenly, the man with the hood turned and locked eyes with me. He stepped closer to the window and with a chilling calmness asked, "Who are you?"
Who are you?
His voice was low and menacing, sending shivers through me. Panic surged through me as I realized he had noticed me. He shouted something to his accomplice, and they both turned toward the door. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. Turning on my heel, I sprinted back to our cabin, slipping and stumbling in the snow. Once inside, I locked the door and pushed a chair against it for good measure. Sam was already on the phone with the cabin's security service, frantically explaining the situation. "Stay calm," the operator said. "We're sending help immediately." Moments later, we heard heavy pounding on our door. The men were outside, trying to break in. The sound of their fists against the wood was relentless, and the door shook with every blow. Sam and I grabbed whatever we could use as weapons, a fire poker and a heavy lamp, and braced ourselves. My hands trembled as I gripped the poker, praying the door would hold until help arrived. Suddenly, the pounding stopped. The silence was deafening, and we stood frozen, straining to hear any movement. Then came the sound of sirens in the distance. The men must have heard it too, because their footsteps retreated, crunching through the snow as they fled. When the police arrived, they surrounded the area and quickly apprehended the two men near the edge of the woods. The woman from the other cabin was rescued and taken to safety. She was shaken but unharmed, and she tearfully thanked the officers for saving her life. As the situation unfolded, we learned that the men were wanted criminals who had been using the secluded cabins as a hideout. The woman they had captured was a resident who had stumbled upon their activities by accident. Her courage and our quick actions had prevented a tragedy that night. The following morning, Sam and I packed our things and left the cabin. The beauty of the snowy landscape now felt tainted by the horrors of the previous night. Though we were grateful to have escaped unharmed, the memory of the hooded man and the terrified woman would haunt us for a long time. Driving away, we promised ourselves to be more cautious in the future. What began as a peaceful getaway in a winter wonderland had turned into a chilling reminder of how quickly things can take a dark turn. I'm a 24-year-old woman, and last month my cousin and I decided to head a few hours north for a cozy winter cabin weekend. It was exactly what we needed, a quiet retreat away from the noise of daily life. The trip went perfectly. The cabin was charming, the snowy landscape was gorgeous, and there wasn't a single creepy moment the entire time. On our last morning, we packed up early, 6 a.m., to get a head start on the 5-hour drive home. It was still dark, and the roads were coated with packed snow from earlier storms. The fog was dense, swallowing everything outside the car's headlights. My cousin, who was driving, and I were chatting and listening to a true crime podcast. We weren't really paying attention to our surroundings. About 20 minutes into the drive, we hit a slick patch, and the car skidded off the road slightly. We grazed a tree, and though it wasn't a major accident, it was enough to jolt us into silence. We got out to check for damage, but somehow, by pure luck, there wasn't a scratch on the car. As we laughed nervously with relief, I shielded my eyes from the glare of high beams coming up behind us. The car had its brights on, and it was blinding. My cousin rolled her eyes and opened the door to get back into the car. That's when the other vehicle blasted its horn, long and aggressive. "What's this guy's problem?" My cousin muttered. The car pulled up beside us, moving slowly on the icy shoulder. It was an old beat-up SUV. The driver stopped right next to us, and I could see the man inside. He rolled down his window, grinning in a way that immediately set me on edge. "Hey there, ladies. Everything okay?" he asked, his tone overly casual, almost mocking. My cousin, ever the diplomat, gave him a tight smile. "Yeah, we're good, thanks." The man tilted his head, his grin widening. "You sure? Looked like you dropped something back there. Couple kilometers back, maybe. It fell out of your trunk." I frowned and looked at my cousin. "Did you shut the trunk this morning?" she asked. Obviously, I replied. We both knew the trunk couldn't have been open. It would have been obvious. "We're fine," my cousin said firmly. She rolled up her window, put the car in drive, and started back onto the road. The man honked again, loud and insistent. My cousin hesitated, rolling her window down just slightly. The man leaned across his seat and held something up. My stomach dropped. It was a pair of women's underwear. "Recognize this?" he said, his voice oozing something sinister. "No thanks," my cousin said flatly, rolling the window up and stepping on the gas. We left him there, still holding up the underwear like some kind of trophy. For the next hour, we tried to laugh it off. "What the hell was that guy's deal?" my cousin said, shaking her head. We didn't see his car behind us and assumed he'd given up. 2 hours into the trip, we pulled off to refuel and grab breakfast at a Starbucks. My cousin placed a mobile order, and I ran inside to pick it up. The snow had started again, light but persistent, and the fog still clung to the ground. As I reached for our drinks, someone's hand brushed against mine, grabbing a napkin. I flinched and looked up, and my heart stopped. It was him. He was standing inches away, smiling like we were old friends. "Look at us. Small world, huh?" he said casually. I didn't say a word. I grabbed the drinks and bolted out of there. As I left, I heard him say to the barista, "See that girl? That's my beauty queen." Terrified, I power walked to the car, almost tripping on the icy pavement. I jumped in and slammed the door. "He's here," I blurted out, barely able to breathe. "What?" my cousin asked, but before I could explain, he walked out of the Starbucks. He didn't have food or coffee, just that same smug grin. He started walking toward our car, waving. "Start the car, now!" My cousin didn't hesitate. She started the engine and reversed out of the spot as he reached into his pocket. For a horrifying second, I thought he was pulling out a weapon. Instead, he held up the underwear again, shaking it at us. We sped back onto the highway, hearts pounding. "How the hell did he get here?" my cousin muttered. We hadn't seen his car behind us once since leaving the cabin. We decided to take an alternate route home, hoping to lose him for good. For a while it seemed to work. But 30 minutes later, as we drove through a small town, a car appeared in our rearview mirror. It was him. He flashed his high beams, then swerved off the road, pulling up alongside us. His window was down, and he was screaming something at us, but we didn't care to find out what. I called my brother-in-law, who's a cop, and told him everything. He advised us to head straight to the nearest police station. Just as he was giving us directions, the man slammed on his brakes behind us. We didn't stop to see what he was doing. In the rearview mirror, I could barely make out his figure sitting on the hood of his car, just sitting there in the snow, watching us drive away. We didn't stop again until we reached home. I don't know how he managed to show up at the Starbucks or why he acted the way he did. I just know I never want to see that man again. From time to time, I enjoy decluttering my home, getting rid of things that no longer serve me. My home office, in particular, had become crowded with old bookshelves, filing cabinets, and furniture that simply didn't bring me any joy anymore. So I decided it was time to part with an old wooden bookshelf that had been gathering dust for years. It wasn't anything special, just a sturdy secondhand piece I'd picked up on a whim, but it had outlived its usefulness. Facebook Marketplace seemed like the easiest way to let it go, so I snapped a few pictures, wrote a quick description, and posted it online. Within a few hours, I got a message from a man named Kevin. He seemed friendly, polite even, asking if the bookshelf was still available and if he could pick it up later that evening. His profile picture showed a middle-aged man with glasses, smiling warmly. Nothing alarming. He seemed harmless, and because I'd never had any bad experiences selling things online, I didn't hesitate to share my address. Later that evening, Kevin arrived right on time. He drove up in an older pickup truck and parked in my driveway. We exchanged pleasantries as I helped him load the bookshelf into his truck. He mentioned he was redecorating his study and that the bookshelf would be perfect for his growing collection of novels. It felt like a typical transaction, straightforward and uneventful. He thanked me profusely before driving off, and I went back to my evening, feeling relieved to have cleared some space. But that was only the beginning. A week later, I was in my living room folding laundry when I noticed a familiar truck slow down as it passed my house. It wasn't unusual for people to drive slowly on our street. Kids often played outside and neighbors walked their dogs. But something about the way the truck lingered caught my attention. It was Kevin's truck. He didn't stop though, it just kept going. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe he lived nearby. Over the next couple of days, however, I began to notice the same truck driving by more often. Always around the same times, once in the morning when I was getting ready for work, and again in the evening as I watered my plants. It seemed intentional, and the unease in my stomach grew, but I kept telling myself it was just a coincidence. Then on a Friday evening, things escalated. I had just finished dinner and was relaxing on the couch with a book when I heard a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I hesitated before walking over. When I peeked through the peephole, my stomach sank. It was Kevin. My heart began to race. What could he want now? I opened the door just a crack, enough to see his face, but not enough for him to push his way in if he tried. "Hi, Kevin. What can I do for you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. He smiled, but his eyes stayed cold. "I was just in the neighborhood," he said casually. "Thought I'd stop by. That bookshelf I got from you. It's great. I was wondering if you had any other furniture you're selling." His words seemed innocent enough, but there was an unsettling edge to them, something off in his tone that made my skin crawl. "No," I said firmly. "I don't have anything else. Just the bookshelf. Glad you like it." He didn't leave. Instead, his smile faded and his expression hardened. "Come on," he said, leaning slightly against the doorframe. "You've got a big house. You must have more stuff you don't need." My heart started pounding. This wasn't right. I stood my ground, my voice growing firmer. "I don't," I said. "I'm sorry, Kevin, but I'm not selling anything else." For a moment, he just stared at me. Then, without a word, he turned and walked back to his truck. I locked the door the second it closed and stood there, frozen. What had just happened? Why had he come back? Why did it feel like this wasn't over? The next morning, I woke up to find Kevin's truck parked across the street. He wasn't in it. At least I didn't see him. But the sight of it sent a wave of anxiety through me. I tried to go about my day, but the truck stayed there for hours. Each time I glanced outside, I saw it. The creeping dread was building, and I couldn't shake the feeling that Kevin was watching me. Later that evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, I heard a loud knock at the door. My stomach dropped. Not again. This time it wasn't a polite knock. Kevin was banging on the door, yelling something I couldn't quite make out. "Open up," he shouted. "I know you're in there." I grabbed my phone, dialing 911 with trembling hands. As I backed away from the door, I could hear Kevin shouting more demands, his voice growing more aggressive, insisting that I was hiding something valuable inside, something he was owed. I shouted back, trying to sound brave. "I'm calling the police. You need to leave." There was a long pause, and then I heard him mutter something under his breath before stomping back to his truck. But he didn't drive away. He just sat there, engine running. I didn't feel safe. I stood by the door, waiting for the police to arrive. They came about 10 minutes later, and Kevin was still sitting outside. 2 patrol cars pulled up, and officers quickly approached his truck. I watched from the window as they spoke to him briefly, then escorted him out of his vehicle. Kevin started shouting and resisting, but the officers quickly cuffed him and led him away. One of the officers came to my door to take my statement. "Do you know this man?" he asked. "I sold him a bookshelf on Facebook Marketplace about a week ago," I explained. "He seemed fine at the time, but now he's been showing up uninvited and acting aggressively. The officer nodded, taking notes. We'll file a report and issue a trespassing warning. If he comes back, call us immediately. Even though Kevin was gone, I still didn't feel safe. I spent the rest of the night triple-checking the locks and windows. My mind raced with what-ifs. What if the police hadn't gotten there in time? What if Kevin had broken in? A few days later, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed the truck again. This time, Kevin was visibly drunk. The screeching sound of his truck stopping outside my house made my blood run cold. He stumbled out, yelling incoherently and banging on my front door. I could barely understand what he was saying, but it was clear he was demanding something. Something he thought I owed him. I called the police again, my hands shaking as I dialed. When the officers arrived, they found him still shouting and stumbling around. They quickly restrained him, cuffed him, and took him away. One of the officers came to my door again. He's being arrested for trespassing and disorderly conduct, the officer said. He's intoxicated, but we'll make sure he stays in custody tonight. Even with Kevin gone, my nerves were shot. I couldn't sleep, pacing the house, my thoughts racing. What if he'd gotten in? What if I hadn't called the police? The thought lingered with me, and I realized how reckless I had been, letting a stranger into my home, even for something as simple as a bookshelf. Since then, I've learned my lesson. Now I use public meetup spots for any online sales, and I never let anyone pick up items from my home. That bookshelf was just a piece of furniture to me, but to Kevin, it was a way in. A way to invade my space and disrupt my sense of safety. Even now, every time I hear a knock at the door, I can't help but feel a rush of anxiety. I never let my guard down completely. I was driving home late one evening after catching up with my cousin, Sam, who was back in town for the winter holidays. His family lives only a few streets away from me, so it's usually just a quick drive. However, my gas light came on halfway through the trip, and I knew I wouldn't make it home without filling up. Luckily, there's a small gas station right between our neighborhoods, so I pulled in. I'd gone straight to meet Sam after work that evening and hadn't had a chance to grab a drink. Not wanting to wait until I got home, I decided to run inside for a soda. It was late and the parking lot was nearly empty. Aside from my car, there were just two others, the employee's vehicle and another older beat-up car parked near the entrance. As I approached the doors, I noticed the guy from the other car arguing with the cashier. He was tall, scruffy, and looked unkempt, like he hadn't bathed in days. I ignored the exchange, stepping inside to grab a drink. As I filled my cup, the man turned and walked toward me. "Hey," he said, his voice gruff. "Do you know how to get to the hospital from here?" I took a step back instinctively. The closer he got, the more I noticed how bad he smelled, like old sweat and cigarettes. Something about him felt off. Still, I didn't want to be rude, so I gave him clear directions to the hospital, which was about 15 minutes away. "Yeah, that's what the guy behind the counter said," he replied, jerking his thumb toward the cashier. "But I don't trust him. He's been giving me nothing but attitude." I forced a polite smile and repeated my directions, trying to keep things brief. The man narrowed his eyes. "Look, I ain't from around here," he said, his tone turning sour. "Why don't you just come with me and show me the way?" My stomach dropped. "I'm sorry, I can't do that," I replied quickly, my voice firmer this time. He moved a little closer, standing between me and the exit. "Why not? It's just a quick ride." I felt my pulse quicken, but managed to keep my composure. "I can't leave my car here," I said, "but if you follow my directions, you'll get there just fine." The man didn't seem to like that answer. His eyes darted around, and he muttered something under his breath. Thinking quickly, I lied. "I actually need to head into work for a night shift," I said, pointing to my name tag, which I'd forgotten to take off. That seemed to throw him off. He let out a huff of annoyance and stomped toward the door, muttering to himself. I stayed inside for a minute, pretending to browse the aisles, hoping he'd leave. When I finally walked up to pay for my drink, I let the cashier know the man had been acting weird and might be trouble. As I turned to leave, I saw the man outside, sitting in his car, staring directly at me. A chill ran down my spine. I grabbed my phone and pretended to be on a call, loudly saying something like, "Yeah, I'm almost there." I walked briskly to my car, trying not to look in his direction. Hey, come over here," he shouted as I got in. I locked my doors and started the engine. That's when I saw him get out of his car and start walking toward me. My hands were shaking as I threw the car into reverse and peeled out of the lot. As I sped down the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw his headlights. He was following me. My mind raced as I tried to think of what to do. I didn't want to drive straight home and risk him knowing where I lived. So, I took the longest, most random route I could think of, turning down side streets and doubling back whenever I could. For a while, his car stayed right behind me, and I started to panic, wondering if I'd ever lose him. Eventually, after several twists and turns, I noticed his headlights were gone. I couldn't see him anywhere. Relieved but still on edge, I finally headed home, locking every door and window as soon as I stepped inside. I barely slept that night, every small noise making me jump. The next morning, I replayed the events over and over in my head, wondering what his intentions had been. That soda definitely wasn't worth it, but I'm grateful I trusted my instincts and stayed alert. Ever since I was a kid, I've loved going to garage and estate sales. We didn't have much money growing up, and garage sales were where I could find toys or books at prices my parents could afford. As I got older, I became fascinated with the collections people amassed and the stories behind the items they sold. Over the years, I've found everything from vintage Disney snow globes to century-old stamps. For the past 8 years, my neighbors and I have organized an annual neighborhood garage sale. It started small, but now about 50 homes participate, and people from nearby communities drive in to shop. My husband, a collector of many things, always has items to sell. We typically price them low just to clear space. We even have regulars who show up yearly to buy furniture or large items. The story I'm about to share happened 3 years ago in July during one of our garage sales. In our advertisements, both online and in the newspaper, we clearly stated the hours and requested no early birds. Still, every year there's always someone who ignores that rule. That Saturday morning, I was setting up the sale while my husband sipped coffee. His job allows him to work from home, so he planned to work in his basement office. He offered to help, but I told him to finish his coffee since I only had a few tables to move. Around 7 a.m., before I'd finished setting up, there was a loud, aggressive pounding on the front door. So loud it startled me. I rushed to answer and found a middle-aged man standing there. He had a disheveled appearance, wearing a faded baseball cap and a scowl. "Yeah, I'm here for the sale. It said you had collectibles," he said bluntly. I nodded. "Yes, we do, but the sale doesn't start until 8 a.m., I explained. He frowned, visibly annoyed. "Well, I'm here now. Why don't you just let me look around?" Trying to stay polite, I said, "We're not quite set up yet, but we'll be open at 8. His frown deepened. "You didn't have to be rude about it," he muttered before storming off to his rusty maroon pickup truck and driving away. When I told my husband about the encounter, he chuckled and teased me about handling it alone. The sale officially started at 8 a.m. and was as busy as ever. By 10 a.m., the rush had slowed, giving me a chance to check my phone. That's when I heard someone say, "Hey, how are you?" Looking up, I was surprised to see the same man from earlier. This time, he seemed cheerful, flashing a wide, unsettling smile that revealed just a few teeth. He browsed for a while, eventually picking out some baseball cards. As he paid, he asked if I had more cards or DVDs inside. I told him I'd check with my husband and might have more the next day. He didn't respond, just nodded and walked off. Later, during a lunch break with my husband, the same maroon truck pulled up for a third time. I leaned over and whispered, "That guy's back again." The man approached us saying, "I thought you mentioned there'd be more stuff later?" "No, this is all we're selling," I replied firmly. "Are you sure? Maybe I could look around inside," he suggested with an unsettling grin. My husband stepped in. "No, everything we're selling is out here. There's nothing else." The man's smile faded. Without another word, he turned and left. Thankfully, we didn't see him again that day. The sale went well enough that we canceled the second day. The following morning, I decided to help a neighbor, Debbie, with her sale. When I arrived, her garage was closed and she wasn't setting up. I knocked on her front door, and Debbie answered in her robe, clutching tissues. Her face was red from crying. "What happened?" I asked. She explained that someone had broken into her garage overnight and stolen several valuable items. My husband only saw the back of their truck speeding off. It was red and rusty, she said. I froze. A maroon pickup? I asked. Debbie's husband overheard and said, "How do you know that?" I recounted my encounter with the man the day before. Debbie and her husband urged me to share the details with the police. I agreed, but unfortunately, no one was ever caught, and Debbie's stolen items were never recovered. Some might not find this story particularly frightening, but the violation of safety in your own neighborhood is deeply unsettling. To this day, the memory leaves a knot in my stomach. We've since installed security cameras and upgraded our locks. I still love garage sales, but I've never hosted one again.